It's not only a very, very special occasion and show for me, because these are two people I really admire, and I'm so proud to be here. And they also, unfortunately, have depressed me a little, because in my PhD, I wish I had worked under them and done some of the kind of work they're doing. It is just so outstanding. And if you read this book, if you read one book this year, read this, honestly, and I'm not just saying it because this is this event. It is so easy to read and so insightful. I'll just read the first line and you'll understand. We'll go through some other aspects of the book. The first sentence is, "We live in an age of growing polarization." And they're talking about everywhere, including India. Thank you both very much for joining us, and many, many congratulations on winning the Nobel Prize, the youngest Nobel Prize in economics ever. Can you imagine? And you're the top of the list, and he's in the top quartile by your scientific classifications. Yeah, maybe the second or third youngest.
I think I have enough gray hair.
Enough gray to deserve it. But I think the first thing we'd all like to know, in very simple terms, what is the difference between your economics and traditional economics?
I guess any statement I'll make will sound bumptious, but I think that I think what we do in economics, or maybe we try to avoid doing in economics, is sort of building this large castle out of many, many, many pieces that we think are self-evident. People behave in this way, therefore this must happen, therefore that other thing must happen, therefore that other thing must happen. It's a long syllogism that...
It's traditional economics.
Yes, is built on very little. We go the other way. We sort of try to be skeptical at every step. We want to say, look, maybe people actually don't behave that way. Maybe actually, one of these shibboleths of economics is false. So we start asking that question from the beginning. So we also build our own castle, but hopefully it's built on things that we have sort of tested and have some idea that it's, at least plausible.
Actually, that's what I love about it, that you look at serious problems that we face in India and around the world, and you measure it from the bottom, field work. You do what are called randomized controlled trials. Explain what they are.
So I guess it starts from the idea that if you don't want to answer a question by just a series of assumptions, if you really want to base it on facts, then you have to unpack it at a level at which you can give a very precise, concrete answer. So for example, if you want to talk about education in general, education is good for growth, or maybe it's bad for growth, or maybe it's good for democracy, or maybe it's got nothing to do with democracy, then you're not going to get anywhere that way. The way you can say something useful about education, for example, is by being much more specific about what is education. Kids, for example, who are in school are not learning. Why is that? Is it because they're unable to learn? Is it because their classes are too large?
You actually measure that, effect of class size on learning.
For example, if that's a question you want to ask,
Yeah.
which is, I think, the first RCT that Abhijit was involved with, then once you have asked the question this way, then it's really the same type of question that you would try to ask in a medical trial.
Right.
So we would take a sample of schools. If you take the example of Abhijit's first randomized control trial, a sample of single teacher school in Udaipur in Rajasthan, and to half of those schools randomly selected add a second teacher. And then measure the outcomes of the kids over a year and see what happens.
Right.
And is it that the kids who got the second teacher do better, or really does it make no difference? So if you find a difference at the end, you know it's because of the second teacher. If you don't find a difference at the end, you know that your intuition that it might be a huge thing was presumably wrong.
Right.
And it was wrong.
It was wrong. Second teacher
Most of
doesn't-
my intuitions are wrong. But that one.
But that's why you test them, right?
Yeah.
You see, the intuitions are wrong because you're Bengali. The highest point in your life was you going to presidency.
That's right.
After that, everything has been, yeah. I must say, when I was teaching in Delhi school, I hate to say, the best students were presidency students. And then you found that people who don't have food first buy a TV set, and they say, that's irrational. How do you make? What did you make of that?
I guess one thing that I feel like one thing that traditional economics did well to emphasize is the idea that before you question somebody's rationality, think about how they think. What's their problem, not how you would think about it.
Right.
And I think one good insight from that, this is not actually something that I've necessarily encountered in the classics of economics, but I think asking the question, how could this be rational, is useful, and it tells you to think about, these guys, they're, the guy who told us that he would rather buy a television than before, getting enough food. He lived in a small village at the edge of the Sahara. There's nothing to do there. After you've, sat in the tea shop for a few hours and killed a few flies, what was there to do? So for him, it was sort of, life was bearable only because he could watch soccer on the television. And to say that, look, you better invest in food, because if you invest in food in 20 years, you're going to get stronger and then you're going to become productive. That's like thinking like an economist.
Right, exactly. That's the rational thing to do and bore yourself to death, in fact.
Exactly. It's a rational, as Amartya Sen said, that's the rationality of the rational fools.
Rational fools, okay. So then you started measuring, okay. Took various random samples, added something in one, didn't have it in the other, checked. And like today, how many people do you have measuring, say, at this moment around the world? And in how many countries?
So about 17 years ago now, we created an organization which is really a network called JPAL, or the Jamil Poverty Action Lab, which has now an office in almost every continent, not one in Antarctica yet. Our biggest one, and many of people from JPAL are here, so maybe they can stand up to be visible.
JPAL,
a minute.
anybody here?
Many of people from JPAL are here, and we are pleased to.
Wonderful work you're doing.
So our office, it's actually one of our oldest regional offices, and the biggest.
So you're in about 40 countries, or you've done studies in about 40 countries now, is it?
We've done
countries.
studies in about 80
Japan.
countries, but India is where we have done the most studies and where our office is the biggest. We have something like 200 permanent staff members.
Wow.
And today, or in these last few days, at any moment, there is about 1,000 people in the field directly collecting data. At this point, I hope they are having their meal and getting ready. But
no, they're checking whether people watched NDTV on TV. Or
but this is about the scale of the operation here in India, and we are working with state governments in many states. We have relationships from the top of the country to the bottom of the country, from east to west, across the political spectrum, working with civil society, with non-governmental organizations,
it's quite a
again in
huge
the entire country.
organizational exercise.
It is a big organization,
being
and
scientifically, very statistically, very strong, rigorous. You have to choose your samples very correctly, your questionnaires so it's a tough exercise, but that's what I love about it. And I think you're famous for saying, all I do is plumbing, and this is a Nobel Prize for plumbing. But it makes such a difference to the world that you know how to give immunization properly, how to motivate people in different ways by your studies. So plumbing matters. Abhijit, plumbing actually...
So I think that, in a sense, going back to your first question, I think plumbing is a lot of what economics should be about, which is, here's a problem, the toilet is choked, it's smelling, what do you do about it? And then there are a few things you can do, and before you call the plumber, and you can try them out, and that particular mindset of sort of assuming that the problem is sort of well defined, it's, you know, the toilet is choked, and that it's solvable by a set of steps rather than by some philosophical gesture. That's, I think, an important part of what makes...
Are you sure you are Bengali? Because Bengalis would look philosophically at
I'm not actually Bengali. I'm half Maharashtrian.
Ah, that's what explains everything. But tell me...
The Ghati blood.
Ghati blood, that explains everything, and Parisian genes that, you know, become practical. But when you started in this world of economics and MIT and Harvard and the rest of the world, and you're saying, I'm a plumber and I'm going to data, must have been a difficult start. What did people say things that...
I think within the world of economists, I would more describe it as benign neglect.
You
it's
want
like
to face
whatever.
benign neglect.
you can do whatever you want. I mean, economists in that sense, perhaps because they tend to believe in people's preferences, and people are quite libertarian. It's like, if you want to waste your time doing that stuff, why not?
Yeah.
You know, nobody's going to stop you. There was more, in a sense, there was more opposition to this way of doing things.
Tough thing to tell.
And in particular, when we came with results that were contrary to the intuition that people held, then that's where we got some people upset. For example, I worked on women as policymakers very early in my career. That was one of my first projects. I did this project with Raghav Chattopadhyay, where we looked at the impact of having a woman as head of the panchayat. And we had a nationwide randomized controlled experiment in front of us, because which village was reserved to elect a woman was randomly assigned. So we sent the staff. The first thing where we had to fight with our field officers, because they're saying, why are you wasting your time? These women are just puppets of their husband. They are not, you see, they're not talking, they're not doing anything. It can't make a difference. You should do some other project about, you know, something else where you would actually find something. And just like getting over, that was our first kind of fight with our own staff. And then once we had the results, actually the first result of this project was to show that these women actually make a difference. They make different decisions. However shy and coy they might look like, they invested much more.
Policies were a little bit maybe more pro-women or something.
Not little bit, lot bit. They were doing really very different things. In particular,
they were doing it, yeah.
Because at some level, they were still in charge. So we saw, for example, a doubling in investment in water infrastructure, which is of direct interest to the woman in the place.
Benign neglect. Actually, I do remember when I started my first election show on television, I was on a panel with some experts, and they said to me and Ashok Lahiri, they said, you know, there are these two people who are doing a little bit of data work. Can we just ask them what they feel? Okay, now shut up, kind of thing. Carry on. That's sort of benign neglect, yeah. So you got through that, but then apart from plumbing, you also talk about, you do nudges. You create situations by nudging the circumstances, both positive nudges and negative nudges. Explain what those are.
Nudges are the idea that maybe a very small reward or a small reminder or something that you think is going to be inconsequential can have large consequences. So the way I think the example we give in our previous book, Poor Economics, is on immunization. So when we were in Udaipur district, the full immunization rate, which is getting children to have 5 shots, was at that point 2%. 2%.
And it's so important. Immunization can change a child's life.
It's the cheapest way to save lives, and it was 2%, the full immunization rate. And if you talk to everybody knew the answer to why. There were 2 views. One is that the government does not deliver immunization. If you delivered it, everybody would take it. That's the view of the NGO sector. And of course, the government's view was, no, these people are just backward. And they don't want immunization because they believe in jhad phuk. So, therefore, they're not going to do it. So there were these two views, and of course nobody bothered to look at any of the data. The data was already pretty clear, because if you look at the full immunization rate, it was 2%, but the first shot, 85% got. So if they really didn't believe in immunization, why were they doing 85%? It? If the government was so incompetent, why were 85%, how could they do it? So neither of the stories could be true. But nonetheless, everybody was confident in their view that they knew the answer. What we did in a randomized controlled trial is we offered first this Seva Mandir, this is a wonderful NGO we've worked with in Udaipur, assured that everybody who wants to get immunized could get immunized. They did organize camps in the villages, and that increased the immunization rate. Actually, by that time, in the control villages, the ones where we changed nothing, it had gone up to 6%. From 6 to 17%, that was if you actually made sure that whenever you want it, you can have it.
Okay, right.
We added to that the fact that if you get your child immunized, you get a kilo of dal every time you do it. And if you do that, it goes up to 36%. So that goes from 6 to 36%, which is an incredibly large increase, mostly by the power of a kilo of dal. So, and this kilo of dal, of course, if you really passionately hate immunization, kilo of dal should do nothing for you.
Right, right.
And if it's impossible to get immunized, and that's why you do it, then the fact that I've assured you that you can get it should do everything. So a kilo of dal in that world can't matter. So this is a classic nudge, something that is so small that everybody will say this cannot matter, but in fact it does.
But it's such a huge impact, and the important point is that by giving a kilo dal does cost, but if your immunization goes up to 36%, the cost per immunized child is not higher, is it?
It's lower. Including
lower.
The price of the dal, the cost per immunized child was lower when you give them the dal, because basically the main cost is this guy who goes to the village to immunize, his time.
His time.
So once you paid him, the extra children you attract, you're getting them very cheap, basically.
So you're reducing cost by making it a little
giving something
experience.
away.
You're going there, you're feeling a little happy about it. And you also found that mosquito nets, how do you get people to use mosquito nets, right? I mean, it changes dramatically the amount of malaria that children get.
So this was actually the idea that mosquito nets reduce malaria is a research that's done by doctors, by medical doctors, not by us.
Right.
But towards the mid-2000s, 2008, the medical consensus was very clear that the best way we have now of stopping the spread of malaria is to distribute malaria bed nets as far as possible. But there was a big disagreement in the aid world into whether you should give the bed nets to people or whether you should ask them to pay for them.
Everybody free, or ask them to pay a little bit, or how do you make people use mosquito nets?
In both cases, the idea was the objective was the same: is how do you get the most nets out and effectively used.
Right.
And on both cases, you had this very strong intuition. On one hand, you had the intuition that if people have to pay, they're less likely to get one, so you're going to get less net out. That seems very intuition, economics 101. On the other side, there was a countervailing intuition that, well, the problem is that if you give someone a net for free, they won't really use it because they won't value it.
For fishing nets or something. Yes.
So people were kind of fighting intuition against intuition. The side that was in favor of selling them was winning, and therefore most people had to pay for the nets, and this is where we were. And this is where research by Pascaline Dupart, who is a former student of ours, came in and said, well, let's test this out.
Yeah.
We can offer the net at various prices, from zero to partial subsidies, and see, do we lose a lot of people by selling it, number one. Number two, if people have to get it for free, are they actually using it less effectively than if they pay for it? And what she found is that there is a huge drop in the number of people who get a net if they have to pay for it. On the other hand, the price doesn't influence use. So that on balance, this is you might as well give them for free. And what is very interesting is that the fact won. And even people who were initially very skeptical about giving nets for free kind
switched.
And what you saw from which we detail in this book, is from 2010, huge spread in the number of bed nets in malaria-infested zone, particularly in Africa. As a result of which, you see a huge decline exactly in those regions in the number of malaria cases.
So here are two examples whereby their kind of work, the different kind of economics they do, you're saving millions and millions of children's lives by immunization and by making people use a mosquito net. These are like two positives. Abhijit, if I can ask you some where you disprove something. In the microcredit area, the whole revolution, and there was a conventional wisdom that microcredit has changed the whole countryside and it's fantastic. And you did actually test it, and what did you find?
That it was kind of okay, meaning it didn't, sadly, it was, you know, people took microcredit, they bought refrigerators, they probably ate better or watched television, they didn't get richer. So the median person, even the, you know, 90% of the people who got microcredit, you can say very precisely that nothing happened to their earnings.
Now, microcredit, just to be, is giving people small loans.
Correct.
Okay.
So you give people, you know, $200, $300 loans. They take those loans, and as the microcredit industry insisted, they do repay, which is great for the microcredit industry at least. It doesn't do anything for the standard of living.
It's amazing.
No doubt are happier to have the television, and you know, now they're busy watching whatever, you know,
NDTV.
Soap on NDTV. I'm sure they're all watching NDTV right now, but whatever it is, it doesn't make them wealthier. Now, there's a caveat to that, which one other aspect of sort of looking at the data is sometimes you figure out that what you said in 2011 isn't quite right. So we said in 2011 very categorically and correctly that it doesn't do anything for 95% of the poor. Now it turns out the 5% who are the exceptions do benefit from microcredit. They are the ones who, and we kind of know who they are. They are people who started a business before microcredit showed up in their area. So there were people who
entrepreneurial.
Yeah, and they didn't start a business because they had taken, you know, this easy loan was available to them. They started a business because they wanted to start a business. Look at those people 10 years later, we keep following them. We see that they, compared to the similar people who didn't get the loan, so people who had a business before microcredit but didn't get the loan, you see that between them there's a big difference. So it does make a difference to people, but it makes a difference to 5%, and to the rest.
So among entrepreneurial types, giving them a loan, microcredit, does make a difference, but giving it to non-entrepreneurial type, it doesn't ruin their lives, doesn't improve their lives.
It might improve their lives. I mean, you know, we have a large loan which we took to buy our house.
That's
it made us happier.
Irrational.
So, you know, I don't grudge anybody their happiness.
Right.
You know, if they want their TV, they can
But
have
economists
their TV.
generally grudge people happiness. Right?
That's true.
No, but what was interesting in your finding out, so how do you find which is the 5% that's entrepreneurial? You would like to give them the money. You use gossip?
Kind of.
I mean, that's shocking. Well, how?
So our students, they did a study where they, basically what they did was they went to, these guys were all businessmen, and they're all in these microfinance groups. And they go to these microfinance groups are basically, microfinance is often organized around groups where, you know, if everybody meets once a week to make their weekly installment on the loan or something, so they knew each other. Not very well, but, and so they asked all of them to name who among them were the best entrepreneurs, and just to discourage the possibility that they'll all say me. They said,
except for you.
Look, name the person who everybody else thinks is the best entrepreneur.
Right.
That's a good trick because, of course, you know, and then there was a prize for guessing the right person. So It turns out that many people guessed the same person. And so what they did then was they took the people who were nobody thought was good, the people who some people thought were good, that's the middle, and the people most people thought were good. And they put them in 3 groups. In each group, they gave some people chosen at random, $100 as a gift. Why did they do that? To find out what do they do with this money? Does it make it richer? And it turns out that in the people who everybody said they were duds, they got 0% return on the money. The people who everybody said were great got 20% per month, which is astronomical on that same money.
Wow.
So there was, what's striking about that fact is that the market is failing so miserably. Here are people who everybody knows they are better. But somehow they are not getting the capital from the market. There's something happening here which is, I don't know what our bankers do, but they don't seem to manage to do something very elementary, which is go ask who's the best guy here and give him the money.
So gossip works. There's internal information flow and people have filters and they say, yes, this guy is good at this guy is good at that, or he's not good at that. But then...
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
So I think this relates to something that we also take on in this book more generally, which is the kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of the social networks.
Right.
So this is one kind of powerful positive use of the social network, which is there is a lot of information that people have on each other that can be harnessed to make everybody's lives better.
Right.
Another example of a positive use of the social network is one that we used again for immunization, to try to do an intervention that can be done at scale and with very little money. We harnessed the gossips in the community, which is we tried and went to see people in the network, in the village, and say, hey, if I have to spread some piece of information about an event or a fair in your village, who should I go talk to? And the first fact that is of interest is they all agree. For example, if you introspect in your dorm, in your social network, in your organization, who is the gossip, you probably know. And you agree. Who you go to talk to when you want something known, or who you would avoid when you would rather something not known. So this we call the gossips. Then we went to see the gossips and say, hey, would you like to do a little something for your communities? We're going to send you an SMS once a month. And then all you have to do is, it's to remind you of the benefits of immunization. All you have to do is to kind of talk about it to other people. Right. And most of our gossips were delighted to participate. It doesn't involve any payment or anything.
It's
not
looking for a new topic.
It turns out I like to talk. That's a new thing to talk. I'll be happy to do that. And so when you do that, we did that again as part of an experiment, which we compared with the effect of giving people small incentives. In this context in Haryana, we did it with cell phone minutes. And what is interesting is you get the same effect.
Cell phone minutes.
Cell phone minutes, when people got immunized, they got some cell phone minutes.
When you go to immunizations, they get cell phone minutes.
Because it turns out that
it's like
as a plumber, we realized that if you try to do dal at the scale of Haryana, it's not happening because the procuring of dal turns out to be a huge headache. Cell phone minutes are much neater to...
Yeah. So dal across the whole country is
doesn't happen.
Tough, but
and in fact, one of our chief plumber friends, Santosh Matthew, who sits there, told that to me about 10 years ago. He said, it's nice your dal idea, but it's not really feasible on a very large scale.
Yeah.
So cell phone minutes turns out to be feasible.
But
so when you compare cell phone minutes to gossips, the gossips actually just as effective, if not a little more. And of course, they're free. So that's the good side. So it turns out
effective as cell phone minutes, almost, gossips?
Better.
See, what I love is that you can actually test and you can say, this is better, that's worth the money, that's not worth the money.
And you know, I really love immunization incentive. But I want to go back to the bad side of social network, because that's something we are also spending time in the book, is that in the same way that it can be harnessed for good, it can be harnessed for bad. Both because there can be collective action that is actually designed to ostracize, that is designed to be to exclude, that is designed to enforce a norm that is against women, for example. It can also be a place where not only good information but bad information circulates and get amplified, such that everybody ends up having the wrong belief. So one thing that we spend a lot of time here is to discuss what has happened to the social network, real and virtual, in the world, and what we can do about it to turn them from being bad to being good.
Right. Last example before we just start looking at the bigger picture. I know bigger picture from the data. Two things. One is very interesting for me as a election analyst, what we call handouts at political time, which are actually asset transfers, or you give people money to buy a girl child a bicycle. You give up, or you just give money, a universal basic income. One, does that make people lazy?
Absolutely no evidence that it does.
And you've tested this?
We've tested this across many countries, many different interventions where people got differing amounts of money, quite large amounts of money, small amounts of money. Sometimes the money comes with some amount of, some encouragement to, so there are different variants of this. In all cases, the average effect on what we call labor supply, a number of hours worked or number of days in the week you work or something, is basically zero.
It doesn't go down. You give them money, it doesn't say I won't work tomorrow.
But in fact, in many cases we find that the giving people money makes them more enthusiastic and more productive.
Really?
So we did a study in Ghana where we actually set up a bag factory to measure productivity. We produced over 100,000 bags in this process, but that means we knew exactly what's happening to productivity. So we could see that people who got a little bit of an extra gift, they were more enthusiastic and they were much more productive.
It's amazing. So one shouldn't call them handouts. That's kind of very economist word.
Well, I hate the word handouts, but I think it's a bigger point we make in the book, which is that I think part of this ideology of, treating people who are not somehow economically successful as moral failures. This is this Victorian ideology, which I think we have continued to imbue, and economics is the flag bearer for that. I feel that that's extremely costly because at some level the world is such an uncertain place. There's so much that happens to us that we have no control over. The Chinese export this, jobs go away, or the exchange rate appreciates and jobs go away, or new technologies are developed in America and jobs go away. All of that, why do we blame individuals for not succeeding in a world where most of what's happening to them are like slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? So I think being more sympathetic to people who have been hit by shocks, and not thinking of them as being, people you are being generous to despite what you should do, but rather being grateful to them for not being more angry about what they
and your
get.
data shows that if you give, I think you call it TUP, targeting the ultra poor, if you give them money or an asset, like a couple of cows, or they don't stop working, it improves their lives and they work harder.
Yeah, this TUP program actually goes beyond a money transfer. It's actually it's a productive asset combined with some help to use that assets. It's a program that was designed by
asset like cows or something like that.
2 cows or some goats or something to start a business. It's a project that was developed by the wonderful organization BRAC in Bangladesh. And this program targets the poorest of the poor. And that's why it goes beyond giving them money. It goes beyond even giving them just the asset, but it also gives them kind of enough to get started with their asset, give them the confidence to get started with their assets. And this program has been evaluated first in Bangladesh and then in 7 or 8 countries around the world. And in all of the countries we found, in some of the countries we were involved, a very large effect in the medium term.
Improve the lives of the poor.
It really improved the life of the poor. And now in India, we've been following these households for over 10 years. And 10 years later, their incomes are still 25% larger than the incomes of those who didn't get the assets at the very beginning.
So one push lasts for 10 years.
And at this point, I would assume, presumably for even longer.
Yeah.
Which is an enormous...
So it's better than fiscal stimulus and...
Oh, it's an enormous return on your investment.
So coming to what's happening in India today, we are in a fairly deep economic crisis, as everybody now accepts. What do you think, say a budget is coming up, what should the finance minister be doing to, say, boost demand, which is really dying, and boost the economy?
I would say first, no more cuts in corporate taxes. I think that was...
No more cuts in corporate taxes.
I think that particular thing, the corporate sector is actually sitting on cash right now. It's not investing. That's the clear fact is that the corporate sector is not short on cash, is not investing. Why is it not investing? Because every sign of a demand problem is there. You can see that basically you talk to people in the corporate sector, say, right now, just there's no market for what I'm going to sell.
Right.
I think you have to get the demand side going. And for that, you need to get the money into the hands of the people who will spend it now, who need the money. Get the money in the hands of poor people, I think.
So your studies, which are like very different to other economic studies, say actually give people money, cash, directly give them money, and then they'll spend it and you'll boost demand. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that comes from our studies. To be honest, I would say that our studies, they do show that when you give people cash, they spend it. But
it shows they don't get lazy.
We don't actually give cash to billionaires and check if they spend it or not. So I can't make the claim that I gave a lot of money to to Mr. Ambani and he didn't spend it. So so there's a little bit of a stretch here. I'm going a step further than.
But what you have found that give cash to the poorer and the lower sections, and they spend it. And they don't get lazy, their productivity remains the same. So the economy will grow as much, if not
exactly.
more.
There would be no, I'm sure that there will be no, people retiring because you gave them a small amount of money. Government started spending a little bit.
So I think that's a major signal which the finance minister should listen to rather than tinker with tax rates, etc. And give money.
In fact, thanks to the effort on plumbing that have been done over the last few years, there have been plumbing efforts that actually makes a policy like that feasible, because people do have bank accounts. There is actually a financial infrastructure that makes it possible to reach people. Right. So it is something that has been built.
This government has built it.
That could be that would be ready to kind of.
Although there is one issue that you have all these bank accounts and everybody's got them. And I've been around the villages during election time, and you find many old ladies saying, look, I'm thrilled to get 1,000 rupees a month cash, but when I go to the bank to get the money, the teller says, you give me 500, only then will I give you 500. They take 500 kickback from an old lady. So that last connection, and we actually, in the bank, called the bank manager and had the lady there and said, look at what's happening. She gets 1,000, but your people take 500. And he said, acha, line band ho gaya. Disconnected.
So that's a great and powerful example of again, the plumbing issue, which is that there is always one detail that you need to pay attention to. But again, the advantage once you have bank accounts is that you can create alternative channels of delivery. You don't have to rely necessarily on the bank teller.
It's a big difference, yes.
You could have a lady sitting with their portable ATM in villages, and in some states like Andhra Pradesh it has been done.
So that is just a step to be addressed.
But it can be addressed.
It can be addressed, exactly. Finally, before we get to questions, there's a lot happening in India, a lot of massive protests on the CAA, the act which decides whether you're a citizen or not. What do you make of this? Is that, again, out of fear, worry? You write about these factors in your book.
Well, I think it comes... there's all kinds of issues there. I don't think I'm not the specialist there. Let me say one thing which worries me from my experience doing field work, is that when you have somebody with an enormous amount of power, the guy who decides whether or not you will be on this list or that list has a lot of power. And so if he is going to say, look, I'm not sure that you're a proper citizen, and forget about religion, says it to...
He has a right to write on your form doubtful.
Yeah.
He has that power,
and
which means
he could also
once he writes doubtful, you have to go on endlessly, and the backdrop is a detention camp. So you have to go through a lot of torture to prove you're not doubtful. You're saying that power is what worries you.
I mean, many things you could be worried about. I'm just saying that's one thing that just prima facie, if I were somebody living in a border district, I would be petrified by that thought. And even if I were, just the fact that somebody could come and say, look, I am in charge of making this list, I could put your name, doubtful, next to your name. I mean, after all, it's a border district. Or I could not. And maybe you can pay me 10,000 rupees or
and
not.
You'll be fine.
I mean, the governance challenge there is very significant.
So what you're saying is that the power, there's too much governance, and the power to decide these things in the hands of an individual. And if he doesn't like your religion, you need not be Hindu, you need not be Muslim, you could be Christian, and they'll say, we don't think, we put you doubtful, you may not pay money.
I'm at least as worried about everything else, just the abuses of power in general.
In general.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that we should worry about creating, structures of the state where people, on one side, you have so much to lose. If you're not a citizen of India and no other country wants you, who are you? Right. So I think at that point, creating power structures which are, make you so vulnerable means you are, you could be extorted in many different ways. So I do think that as a governance problem, it's a very frightening one.
Last thing on this, so it's not just religion, you said. That means if you're, say, a Hindu and you are really opposing the government in your area or opposing the local authorities, they may take it out on you in this way. So it's not only Muslims or Christians should worry, everybody should worry, just by this governance.
Yes, I mean, it's just
excessive
power
governance.
To some people to take decisions that can have massive consequences for your life. I think those decisions are we need to be extremely careful in designing institutions to make those decisions. They should not be made kind of by, quick acts of parliament.
Right,
that's the worry that.
Shall we take questions? Now, so many questions. That's a good sign.
A very good evening to both of you. I'm Priyanka. I'm very curious to know, how do you put the time frame on your RCTs? Because I understand social complex problems take some time to reflect the real outcomes. So, and how do you justify that whatever time frame you have put to your RCTs are the real, they are justifying your studies?
One thing we don't do is claim that we know the absolute perfect truth. You have to take a decision at some point. The reason why you have to put a time frame is not because you have some absolute notion that this is the right time frame. It's because you know that there's a compulsion to take decisions. And so, if you don't provide any evidence, then the decision will be taken without any evidence. Some evidence is better than no evidence. So I think we are fully aware of the fact that, maybe after 17 years, the tide will turn and go the other way. And indeed, I'm sure in some cases that happens, but I don't see a way to wait for that long. I mean, I think there is a compulsion of having some answer, and I think the evidence that we generate is still useful.
Yeah, at the back there. Go ahead.
Good evening, ma'am and sir. My question is, what are your views on farm loan waivers and what impact do they have on Indian economy?
I mean, farm loan waivers are, I'll tell you what let me not answer exactly that question, but answer slightly related, but I think more fundamental question, which is that I think one reason why farm loan waivers are used is that we actually have a very underdeveloped machinery for providing support to people who are in distress. We don't have, this is what we're saying right at the end, developing a welfare system where if you can predict that in this particular area the rainfall has failed for 3 years in a row and a lot of people will be in distress, let's give them some help. After all, this is not in their control. That's something we can't do easily. So what we do instead is to use these klutzy instruments like farm loan waivers, which are really inefficient ways and unfair ways to compensate people. Somebody who didn't take a loan doesn't get compensation. But it's a way to get money to some people, some of those people. So I think one thing we need to focus on is developing more efficient machinery so that all the people, and not just those who've taken loans, can be compensated.
Right.
Hello, sir. Hello, ma'am. My name is Ria, and you guys are such a huge inspiration to me personally and a lot of my peers, because we got into economics hoping that we can make a difference in the world, and you both sitting here are the biggest examples of how that's possible.
You're very kind to say that. I'm not sure that's true.
He said she meant relatively.
Relative to all those economists who do monetary policy.
In all possible, Professor Duflo is one of my biggest inspirations.
It was me, not you, that's why.
If I only mentioned you, I would have agreed.
So my question is related to two Latin American countries, which are Brazil and Mexico. So both of them have programs. Mexico has Prospera, or what at some point was probably known as Prospera, and the Bolsa Familia in Brazil. Now these are programs that are extremely complex in the sense that they have some conditional cash transfers. There are aspects related to how households have certain outcomes that they need to show in order to get those or maintain those kind of assistance. What I've understood so far is that we can alter in RCTs, we can alter 1 or 2 things. In a situation where you have more than 3 or 4 things to evaluate, how do you design this kind of an RCT? What kind of control groups do you have, and how do you basically evaluate those kind of programs that are that complicated?
Right, okay.
Right, that's a great question. So Progressa was kind of a very important program, both because it was kind of a very solid attempt of putting actually a lot of money in the hands of the poor against what there was a lot of opposition of doing that at the time. And it was kind of a brilliant political move at the time by Santiago Levy, the architect of the program, to say, oh, but I'm not just going to give them the money, I'm going to make them to work for it through this conditional cash transfer. And I think part of him believed in it, the conditionality, and part of him also thought, and he kind of said quite explicitly, that it was a way to build consensus for the program. The other reason why Progressa was very important is that he got an evaluation of it, and this is in fact started in 1997, the first big government-run RCT in the developing countries, and in that sense a game changer, because it showed to us that it could be done. It's not just some nutty academic like Michael Kramer or Abhijit Banerjee who do it. It can actually be done by government. For example, I was involved in a program in Morocco where we did a version of the program that had all the bells and whistles and conditionality, etc., and one version that just gave the money and said, by the way, this is to help your kids go to school. And there was no conditionality attached to it, and it was just presented as it might help your kids go to school. And we found slightly better effects
when it was that
than the conditional version.
Okay.
Because in part because it avoids discouraging some people to even try. And then people have kind of replicated this type of things again, so that we now know that maybe the conditionality is not that important, but maybe labeling it is sufficient to get enough of a nudge without having this very complicated, expensive administrative system. So little by little, project by project, you kind of build the evidence base. It's not done in all one big swoop. Although sometimes you can go around and do one big experiment that has lots and lots of different treatments that can then be compared. But typically it comes after you have some idea of how your package is working,
and then you can,
and then you unpack them, or some idea of how one component is working, and then you put it inside the package.
Firstly, congratulations for the Nobel win. My question is that, I spent 3 years learning economics, Keynes, Marx, all these guys, and now here comes a bunch of economists who say that, data is the new thing. So my question is that, what is the relevance of economic theory in an age of data science? Because you disproved Stolper-Samuelson theorem in your 3rd chapter maybe. So, but that was like staple diet for us as BA students. But now that's gone. So what should we do?
You're ruining people's lives. You realize that?
So my question, being very specific, is that what is the relevance of economic theory in an age of data science?
You can't disprove something if it's not claimed. So I think the only way we learn is by building narratives, and then some of them get to be proved and some get disproved. If you didn't know the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, you could not disprove it. So I think that's the nature of progress.
So it's still relevant?
Yeah.
Feeling better?
Hi. Again, I remember reading both of your works in 2013 in my graduate studies, and my professor clearly mentioned saying, you will win Nobel. And she kind of got it right. I personally work in climate change, so I have a larger question and a much more specific question to your work. The larger question is the dichotomy between growth and sustainability that people in the saving the world business struggle with. So that's your opinion on it.
So some of our colleagues talk about what you're talking about, the argument between sustainability and growth as the Greenpeace answer in not very positive term. And we took back in our chapter on climate change, we have a chapter on climate change in the book, and we took back that Greenpeace answer and said, well, maybe we are just lucky enough and the technology will improve sufficiently that we can continue to consume more in the rich countries, as well as have the necessary improvement in the living standard in the poor countries, and everything will be fine ever after because we'll all be powered by clean stuff, etc. But then maybe not. And maybe the Greenpeace answer is correct, and maybe there is going to be a need for consuming differently or maybe consuming less in the rich countries. Particularly as in the poor countries, the consumption level need to go up because it's about real bottom line quality of life. But then what you're saying is that, look, even though we discussed today about taking people's preferences seriously, one thing we also talk about in the book is maybe we shouldn't take them too seriously. The one problem economists have about anything like the Greenpeace answer is that, it would make people in the US so sad to consume less air conditioning and to have smaller cars and to drive the train to work instead of driving their car. But then, maybe not. Because maybe they are consuming this way because that's the way they are used to. Maybe they are consuming this way because this is the way their friends are doing. Maybe they're consuming this way because that's what TV tells them is the right thing to do. And maybe these preferences can be changed. And in fact, there is plenty of evidence from experiments and from non-experiments that we are creatures of habits, and we can change the way we consume. And we are social creatures, and what other people do and what we see on television, etc., influences what we do. And therefore, it is possible to get the Greenpeace answer without making people in Texas actually miserable as a result of it.
One of the things you just mentioned, which actually worries me a lot, if I may ask you a question, you tend to suggest that television does have an impact. That really worries me. You had some experiments with sitcoms, and that really changed people's lives. If television does change people's lives, it is deeply worrying, isn't it? You're meant to say no.
I'm going to. I unfortunately have no RCT so far on the impact of a discussion on high economic issues. So
Thank God.
No doubt that would make people much better off. But what I do know is that we have now several examples of either soaps or sitcoms and looking at their effects on people's lifestyle changes, and in particular lifestyle changes which have a lot to do with quite, for example, HIV and safe sex. So we have a study in Nigeria where we look at we basically worked with MTV, and MTV made this really quite well-produced soap called Sugar. And what Sugar does is it doesn't talk about HIV, doesn't lecture people about it. It kind of gets people involved in the viewers involved with the lives of these people, and suddenly confronts them with the fears that HIV brings to them. So there's this scene where this guy is waiting. He is now finally is frightened and is gone to get tested, and is waiting for his test results. And that's a scene which is extremely powerful, and lots of the viewers end up sort of reacting to that and saying, look, maybe we should take this seriously. So I think one thing television does,
so it had impact on people's behavior
very powerfully, is it takes away that layer of, okay, yeah, we've heard that, don't lecture us. This is not lecturing. It's getting you into a situation where you haven't thought about it, but because you identify with these characters, it brings you to that situation. And when it brings it to you, you sort of react by saying, oh my God, I should actually take it seriously. And we find this has been found in a number of different
so maybe
countries.
Bollywood films, which are fairly progressive generally compared to television, would have an impact?
I think my guess is that they've had an impact. It just, I haven't quite got a Bollywood producer to agree to randomize.
I'm sure you could. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, and thank you to all three of you on stage for the wonderful evening. My question is more on the actionable part of the results research conducted. So in cases where the policymakers have a lack of focus on the issues concerned, how do you transcend from the results being accumulated from the data collected into it actually benefiting the concerned people?
So first of all, so that's great questions, and in fact, it's kind of at the heart of what we do, because the tagline of JPAL is translating research into action. So we are, I think, both from our different paths, and that's true as well as many people who work in JPAL came into this particular way of doing work because we wanted to affect the lives of very many people, not just understand their lives, although we would like to do that as well. But we see that those two things are going together. So I think there are two, we learn a little bit over the years how this happens, and that it's not like a drug where you do your trial and then you put it to market and you're hoping the best. Like policy making is not like that. One way in which it really happens is that often the research itself is done with the policymakers directly. For example, again, Santosh Matthew, who is sitting here, we've been working with him.
Santosh Matthew, please stand up. He's made a huge transformation in plumbing.
Master plumber.
Master plumber, Delhi School of Economics.
Santosh Matthew, master plumber, who was for many years in the government. Kind of, we worked with him on the problems that he was facing in the implementation of the major program that he was running at the time, the NREGA program, and that's one example, but it's actually one of many. And in that case, the kind of the policy making and the research go together, which doesn't mean there is no ebbs and flow, and there, God knows there are setbacks, but then it kind of lives its life inside the process. We've had similar experience with the police department in Rajasthan, working with Nina Singh. We've got similar experience with the Haryana government. We discussed the immunization work was done directly with them to address their requests. So then the two things don't get mixed up. When we have done work that was initially outside, for example, our work with Pratham on remedial education started completely outside, and then kind of found way to get embedded within the government. And that is also a process that has many twists and turns. That's not very linear, not so much because of lack of focus from policymakers, but because we get a lot of things wrong. Both policymakers get a lot of things wrong of what is their actual power on the people they work with, of what people react to. So there are many things to learn that is about the actual implementation of an idea at scale, which is itself kind of one more layer of work. But this work kind of, once you are willing to be patient, then it sort of happens, not in any kind of flash of conversion,
but they're not always resistant, because they also want to gain from improving things. Is that right?
No, absolutely. And in fact, I think this is something that has definitely changed dramatically over the last.
Because it's their self-interest also.
Over the last 2 decades, both in India and elsewhere in the world, that there is just much more interest at various level of policy, from the very top to the very smaller level, because people see that this is kind of quite useful. We're also not so much into lecturing, and more into working together and figure out what the issues are and incorporating what we might know from elsewhere.
So you don't find resistance all the time?
Not really. I mean, often what we find, which is also frustrating, is they say, yes, but we don't have any time. We agree with you. The time to do it. Can you come and do it for us? And that's a little bit awkward, because we're not really designed to move to Patna and live the rest of our life there. So it turns out difficult thing to.
But at least they say do it for us, so then you can have a team.
What we've tried to do in JPAL is to create a facility where somebody, a policymaker who wants to actually implement a policy change, we can help them recruit and even pay for somebody to work with them to do that.
You can design the whole thing.
To who will help them, not just design, also be the Man Friday who's going to any policy changes, answering 70 questions in Parliament, and writing 87 memos and PowerPoints and all that. So all of that work. So we often provide people. Santosh had somebody like that in MHRD.
I'm a law student, final year law student. My name is Ravi. So my question is regarding, I think we were siding with Rawls when we said we should provide primary goods. And then I think the critique by Amartya Sen already pointed out by Professor Banerjee that we see the capability, like if we give the micro loan to 2 people, but one might be able to use it in a better way and one might not be able to. So, and then your data says that providing primary goods is effective. So how do we reconcile the critique with what your data says and what John Rawls said, by providing primary goods with education, and how do we procure data to determine capability for that which we use gossip or social networking? And in a big country like India, how do you establish a system to understand the capability, and how do you reconcile the critique with the...
I think you're making a very good point. But I think one shouldn't also aim too high. I think the idea that we're going to design a policy for everybody which will be tailored to their needs is a little maybe Panglossian. So I would say one thing that I think for a country like India, precisely because we don't know what everybody needs, but we know that being desperately poor to the point where you can't feed your children is not a reasonable outcome for a society. Nobody should have to face that. So I think having a basic kind of a social minimum net is important. And then I think we can design programs where there is some amount of self-selection. I think one of the things that microfinance did, which was maybe less helpful, is that they decided that they would actually gather no information. Anybody who wants it can get a loan. Now, you could do other things. You could say, look, we're going to come and one idea we had proposed many years ago was to hire a local cost accountant and send them to the businesses and tell us, do you think, you've been working here, dealing with these businesses for such a long time, tell us if this looks like a good business or not. We don't do things like that. The banker's world, I'm afraid, lives entirely outside the world, the real world of small businesses. And therefore, these ideas where you have to bridge that gap really never get tested. So we never got a chance to test that because no one really wants to touch it. And so I do think that we can tailor things, not perfectly, not even remotely perfectly, but I do think that there is a lot more than what we actually do that can be done.
We're running out of time, but I thought I'd give both of them a chance which they've never had before. You always wanted to ask Esther that one question. Now's your chance, and you can ask a question after you've answered his question. One question which you've always wanted to but never had a chance. Now's your chance. What's the question you want to ask Esther?
I cook dinner every day. What is the dish you like the least of all the dishes?
Is there a whole series or only one?
What she likes the least. So it's well defined.
I think that's a fake question because he knows that when I don't like something, I say it. And so actually he perfectly knows what I like a little less and what I like the most.
What is the worst?
Which is the worst?
Again, that's a fake question. I don't really like chicken. because I'm saying it, but he still manages to kind of make it come in and say, yes, you can like chicken.
He's been wanting to ask you this for a long time. What's your question that you've always wanted to ask him, but...
this is related to my answer to this question. I don't really have one.
What?
I think one way in which our relationship works is that we are both reasonably transparent and blunt with each other and with other people. and so I think
Any question then.
But I think I've always asked him. I think if I have a question, I just ask him.
Go for it.
He's already been asked.
Well, I can tell you one of the first questions I asked him much before I knew him personally, when he was a professor and I was a student, which was, can you be a development economist if you're not Indian?
Wow.
No. If you can be a development economist if you are not South Asian.
South Asian. And what's your answer?
Pakistanis,
what's your answer to that?
I think there's some evidence
It was obviously the right questions.
He said, of course you can. So maybe that was the question. He said, of course you can. And then maybe I'm always wondering whether it was a polite thing to say.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed. We completely ran out of time. We could have gone on for another 5 hours. It was just fascinating.
No, you.
Thank you very much.